All right, so welcome everybody to the second webinar of the Exploring Planetary Justice series. In the first webinar last month, we explored planetary justice within Latin America, and this webinar explores planetary justice in Western Europe. We are hosting these types of webinars because intersecting social and environmental challenges are affecting and endangering the human and non-human realms on Earth. This has intensified demands for justice, with some scholars proposing the concept of planetary justice. However, what exactly planetary justice means and whether this resonates with existing scholarship and practice of justice, especially in the ecosocial sense, is currently underexplored. This joint initiative between the Planetary Justice Task Force of the Earth System Governance Project and the Center for Environmental Justice of Colorado State University aims to establish an international network of researchers who are interested in exploring the place of planetary justice within their thinking and practice on ecosocial justice. The Earth System Governance Project is a global network of scholars working at the interface between global environmental change and governance issues, and you can learn more about the project by visiting earthsystemgovernance.org. Are also welcome to become involved in the work of task forces, working groups, and publications of the project. The Task Force of Planetary Justice has been conducting this series of webinars across different world regions under the title Exploring Planetary Justice. In each edition, participants are invited to address three main prompts, drawing on their own research and experiences, which we will compare and synthesize at the end of the webinar series. As I said before, in this webinar, we focus on Western Europe. We have a wonderful panel, as well as moderator. So Caroline Senit, assistant professor at Utrecht University, is going to moderate this discussion. And Stefan Pedersen, honorary research fellow at the University of Sussex, will monitor the questions and comments at the chat. So please put your questions in the chat. You can put your questions throughout the webinar. He will then read these comments and questions, and Caroline will moderate the discussion. And with that, I give it to Caroline to take it from there, and I wish you a very productive and enjoyable discussions.
Thank you so much, Agni. Thanks also to you, to Dimitris and Stefan for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to moderate this wonderful panel of speakers. So we have four distinguished speakers today to discuss the different conceptualizations and materializations of planetary justice from Western Europe perspective. So I'll just introduce them briefly in alphabetical order. So first we have Brendan Colsaich, who's a research professor at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. Brendan has co-founded the JUST research group in Belgium on social and ecological justice, and he is also an organizing committee member of the French Environmental Justice Network. Then we have Florian Dunkman. Florian is a professor of cultural geography at the Institute of Geography at Kiel University in Germany. He's a member of the Kiel School of Sustainability and the EnJust Network for Environmental Justice. And at the moment, his research interests focus on social development in rural areas. Then we have Sherilyn McGregor. Sherilyn is a professor of environmental politics at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom, where she conducts research on the relationships between environmental sustainability and social justice with an intersectional ecofeminist theoretical lens. And last but not least, we have with us Francesca Rossignoli, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Public Law at the Universitat Rovira i Virgili in Tarragona in Spain. And she studies environmental justice with a special focus on climate refugees in the European context. And this is the topic also of her latest monograph. So yeah, as I said, we have a wonderful panel of experts today with different backgrounds, different topics of research that will each provide their reflections on how environmental justice is conceptualized in Western Europe and how also it materializes, how it can be achieved. And this is actually a region that is extremely rich in terms of movements that seek to achieve justice. So I think I will learn a lot here. So yeah, we are excited to hear their perspective on environmental justice in this context, based on the 3 prompts that Agni mentioned earlier. So you have about 3 minutes to answer these 3 prompts. And without further ado, I'd like to hear first your views on what you see as the major theoretical and political tendencies within ecosocial justice in your region. First, starting with Brendan. So Brendan, what is your take? Thank you.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me okay. Just to clarify, I'm mainly going to talk about France because that's what I've been working on, even though I'm based in Belgium, as Caroline just said. I'll start with the political tendencies, and I'd say there's 3 big ones. I mean, big ones. There's 3 that should be mentioned here. There's probably more, but at least 3. And the biggest one is obviously one that you know has been the Yellow Vest movement in France in 2018, 2019, that has had the advantage, at least, to put ecosocial justice, to use the word that was used here, on the political map, because it was triggered by plans by the French government to raise taxes on gasoline, which of course was going to impact people who rely on their cars more than others, especially in rural areas. It was going to impact them more than other people, obviously. And so for the first time in France, it was made visible, this tendency between social and environmental issues, or the overlap between the two, was made visible in a country where these things were long seen to be exclusive to each other, right? And so that's the first sort of big political moment where or political tendency that should be mentioned. The other one, the second one, is the recent sort of evolution around climate justice, or the climate justice movements, and these are of 2 types. The first one is sort of old style environmentalism that is rebranding itself through climate justice. You see the sort of original environmental NGOs now using climate justice to present themselves. It's not always clear what that means and whether that's only strategic, but I'll leave that in the middle. We can come back to it. But there's also sort of newer forms of environmentalism that take this justice element more at the heart than the old style environmentalism, if I can put it like that, right? And then there's a third element that should be mentioned that the French call popular ecology, and that comes out of that is probably closer to what we know as the original US environmental justice movement, that comes out of the racial minorities, the banlieues in France, and that tries to use or define what an environmental movement or an ecological movement would be from their perspective. So for the margins of French society. That last one is rather marginal, but the interesting part of the last one is probably the one that is the closest to having a theoretical reflection as well. as compared to the two other ones, which I think is very interesting. There's a whole literature now in France on what is called decolonial ecology, which then fuels the discussion on popular ecology, and there's a sort of crossover between the more activist groups and the more theoretical groups within that area. Apart from that, and I'll leave it there because I'm already talked for 3 minutes. There's been work on what the French call environmental inequalities or ecological inequalities since the early 2000s, more or less, which is the main sort of theoretical development, theoretical work on these things, and which comes from mainly intergenerational justice that was included in the sustainable development discourses and whatnot, rather than from a sort of grassroots development that we've seen in the US. And I'll leave it here. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Brendan, for this to the point overview of the French context and how justice, ecosocial justice, emerged in that context. I think it's interesting to see that it's first started with environmental inequalities, to then evolved as a sort of a more globalized movement with climate justice, and then took a decolonial turn in recent years. So I think we can later discuss this a bit more. But I'd like to go now to our second panelist, Florian. What is your take on this issue?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Florian from Germany, and I was wondering when. First of all, thank you for the invitation to talk here. It's a very interesting panel. And I was thinking, well, there's a certain tension. On the one hand, we talk about planetary justice, which is really planetary, and then I have to talk about my region, which is Germany, and maybe I took Germany as an example of a certain, let's say, a certain constellation, which is not unique to Germany, but maybe I want to build up a certain point using the example of Germany. Germany is, on the one hand, it's a wealthy nation. It's a nation at the same time where a lot of these consumer habits are in place that cause, well, all kinds of ecological problems and social problems all over the world. So we are living a lifestyle which is not sustainable, which is unjust. And at the same time, in Germany, we do have a ecological movement. We have a fairly strong Green Party, and it has a long history. We have the growing consciousness, and we have, I would say, John, large parts of the German population are full of goodwill to do something. We do have sustainability education in schools and everything. And this results. I'm first of all concentrating on the political tendencies. What is really going on here in Germany? All in the political sphere are all the turns going on. Mobility turn towards a more sustainable mobility, an energy turn towards more sustainable energy. We have an agricultural turn. So we are full. German politics is full of turns, always supposedly turns in the right direction. And at the same time, what we constantly see is how very, very hard this is. These are really grinding turns. This is not easy at all. Although, well, the goodwill, I would say, with a large part of the population, it is there. So even though many people might be willing to participate to do that, there is still, it's still very hard. And maybe in the second and in the third prom, I can come back to that maybe I can build up a diagnosis of that in the second, and maybe turn it more into scientific, tendencies in the third prompt. But maybe this is the political landscape here. A lot of goodwill, a lot of turns, but yeah, why is it so hard?
Yeah, okay. Very hard materialization. So the question is indeed, how can planetary justice or ecosocial justice be achieved within the context of Germany? And we can get back to that. Thank you, Florian. Next is Francesca. What is your views, your perspective? Thank you.
Yes, hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me to this stimulating event. As for the theoretical tendencies, I would say that academics in Italy initially focused on the on political ecology and the centrality of environmental conflicts, and only recently they started to examine, for example, the difference between social justice and environmental justice and the relationship between the two things together, and also the difference between environmental justice and climate justice. So I'm sorry, because of course we can't compete with the long tradition existing in the United States. This topic is at the very infancy in Italy. But anyway, I've noticed that there is also a lively debate in terms of which methodology can better address and better capture the environmental inequalities in my country. And of course, scholars debate in terms of whether we should use quantitative methods or qualitative methods, because sometimes it's difficult to access data. And therefore, many scholars are suggesting to at least to complement a quantitative analysis with other alternative methods, for example, with interviews or focus groups or whatever, with other methods. And as for the political tendencies, yeah, the situation is also a bit disappointed because we don't have an important green political party. It's quite absent from the political scene, from the political arena. So the only politician that that is aware of this topic of environmental justice is the secretary of the Democratic Party, Ellie Schlein. She's aware of what environmental justice means, but still she wasn't able to take this topic on board and to use this topic also in the political arena, so to speak. So I would say that in Italy, the political tendencies concerning environmental justice is more addressed by non-state actors like think tanks or environmental associations, and probably I can have more time to address this question during the second prompt, so I don't waste too much time, because I think that my 3 minutes are over. So thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. It's interesting to see how, already how the situation and the political landscape is quite different across Europe, across Western Europe, and countries such as Germany, France, and Italy. So I hope we can get back to this in the discussion. And now we will hear from Sherilyn.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I think I'd like to sort of distinguish between the sort of political context and the academic context in my response. And I suppose the view from the UK is always a good place to start by saying that we don't, in the UK, it's well known that there isn't a kind of environmental justice movement such as there has been in the United States, that we're at least 20 years behind, 30 years behind the United States in terms of an environmental justice movement so defined. To the extent that there is an environmental justice agenda, it has tended to be very top-down with quite weak leadership. And if we look at what the governments have done over the years, there was a flurry of activity in the early 2000s under the Labour government in commissioning research from say Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, to do specifically defined environmental justice research in deprived areas of the UK. And the focus is very much on deprivation and class and poverty. And that got quite a lot of attention at the time. Since we've had almost 20, not 20 years, but we've had yeah, many years now, since 2010, of conservative government. That research has not been funded. It hasn't been a focus of the government. To the extent that the government is interested in something called environmental justice, it's quite apolitical in terms of focusing on health inequalities around things like air pollution. There may be some interest in big issues of the Sustainable Development Goals and climate justice, but I wouldn't say that that is a kind of what we would understand as scholars of environmental justice to be a very fruitful focus. Very much lack of interest in race and racialization and colonialism. Very much not interested in multi-species justice. This is from my kind of a political view. Academic circles, I would say one of the main tendencies would be that there isn't a kind of comprehensive approach to environmental or ecosocial justice in the UK. I would say that we have a lack of interdisciplinary research on environmental issues, environmental social science in the UK. There isn't a kind of environmental studies tradition as there is in the United States and Australia and other places. So it's quite fragmented, I would say, by discipline. For example, we have a philosophy department here at the University of Manchester with only one environmental philosopher. There isn't a kind of sort of an embracing of environmental subjects across the humanities and social science that certainly is in my experience. So we see a kind of fragmentation across disciplines and different approaches to questions of an ecosocial justice in disciplines, whether it be geography, politics, or philosophy. And I would say too that when within those disciplines, there's a specialization in a kind of niche approach. So it might be energy justice or food justice or climate justice and so forth. So I think there's a real sort of fragmentation in terms of a tendency. And I wouldn't say there's any one theoretical tradition that dominates.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlene. This is very insightful also to know a bit the academic landscape in terms of ecosocial justice or planetary justice. Yeah, I'd like to come back later in the discussion and ask the other members of the panel how it is, right, in their own academic context, whether they observe similar tendencies. I would be, I mean, personally very interesting in hearing your views on this. But yeah, I don't want to disrupt the the prompts here. So yeah, I think that the intellectual roots of environmental justice versus ecosocial justice are quite diverse, also according to different academic contexts. So let's move to the second prompt, the second question. What are, in your view, the forces for or against ecosocial justice in your region or in your context, in your country, in addition to the global or planetary levels? And this time we'll start backwards, so with Sherilyn.
Okay, so I think I'll start with against, and then so I can end on the positive with the for. And I think the main sort of forces against movements and research and progress towards ecosocial justice in the UK would be the stranglehold that still exists on the part of neoliberal behavior change, pro-growth ideology. That there's a sort of a kind of belief in the technological fix to the ecological and climate crisis. There's still a notion that we can grow our way out of the problem, and it's underpinned by a kind of behavioral psychology kind of understanding that individuals just need to change their bad behavior in order to drive decarbonization and change. So I think that has a stranglehold over not just popular consciousness, political consciousness, but also academics are running after money to do that type of research. I think that the other thing that's quite a sinister force is a kind of rise of what you could call an anti-net zero populism. In the UK, it's a kind of the Brexiteers have gone on to reconfigure around opposing pro-environmental justice type policies around things like low traffic zones, 15-minute cities, low emission zones, and they've really tried to capitalize on a kind of almost a populist understanding of, you know, these policies are bad for poor people, therefore we should oppose them. And actually 44% of people in the UK now support a referendum on net zero, so that they can basically say there's no they can vote against it, which is a kind of configuration of the Brexit forces. I think a third one would be a kind of emergency thinking, which I think has kind of been promoted by groups like XR, which is almost like, we don't have time for these debates about justice. We just need to, you know, listen to the science and move forward. In the so forces four with my last minute. So forces four, I think, for like the cause of ecosocial justice, I think we do have a lot of good academic research and a solid evidence base to make the arguments. So not necessarily a well theorized set of arguments, but certainly there's a lot of evidence around environmental inequality and justice to draw on. And that is, I think that's where we can start. A couple of other things I think we're definitely seeing since COVID to kind of counteract the populist forces, a kind of belief in a sort of another way is possible. People lived through a pandemic where they had to adopt different ways of living, different temporalities of living, different ways of provisioning and caring for each other. And I think that sort of care, sense of care and foundational economy and essential work has changed a little bit of the ideas about how we think about the big forces of neoliberal growth and so forth. So I think we can hopefully harness some of that sentiment for maybe developing campaigns around ecosocial justice, and I might say more about that later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Charlene, for ending with the positive note. So I'd like now to ask Florian what he thinks or he identified as the forces against and for ecosocial justice in the context of Germany.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Since I started off with this, description of the circumstances, Germany full of goodwill, we have an ecological movement, we have a Green Party, but there's not much happening or not enough happening. Why is that? Maybe I want to take this force against ecosocial justice and I'd like to introduce the concept of imperial lifestyles, which I find very, very important or very, very, very clarifying. It's a concept by two political scientists, and imperial lifestyle says imperialism is somehow deeply ingrained in all our everyday life, in our consumption habits, it's in our infrastructure, in our institutions. So changing the way you live, not to cause any harm anymore and not to be imperialist anymore as we are, is not easy, because it's not a question of goodwill or something. It's a question of changing the whole structure. And we are living also with all our goodwill in Germany. We are living a life where that we are living in a structure that shifts the negative effects of our behavior, of our consumption patterns, to elsewhere, to other regions of the planet. And we are talking about planetary justice, not just justice in Germany. We are talking about planetary justice, what we do with other parts of the world. So we are constantly shifting the effects, the negative effects and the costs to elsewhere. And I find this very interesting. How does this work, this shift to elsewhere? How is it done? How is elsewhere somehow produced like that? And I think this elsewhere is not just geographical distance. It's also something. What happens in the apartment next door is well, it's not far away, but it's elsewhere. And I think what is interesting is to think more about, and I think this concept of imperial lifestyles really helps us. How do we construct communities of justice? Yeah. So how do we construct somehow boxes where questions of justice can be put, of equality and whatever, but from box to box, we are living in one planet, but here again, we are talking about France, we are talking about Great Britain, we are talking about Germany. We are making these compartments saying, well, now these are boxes, and questions of justice are often posed only in these boxes. And if you want to jump from box to box, and if you want to really establish something like a planetary vision, this is very hard. We all tend to stay in our boxes. And I think that these questions of how can we create a community of justice beyond this, what we call Westphalian system, the system of nation states, which is so very natural to us. What policies and what scientific projects can help somehow working against this compartmentalization of communities of justice. I think this is very, very interesting, and I think this is one very abstract diagnosis. I see that I'm more abstract than my other colleagues, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Thank you so much, Florian. I think that what you just said about imperial lifestyles and how the world is embedded in one big box really resonates or makes me think of what also Brendan mentioned about the decolonial turn in justice. So maybe this is. This relates a bit to decolonial theory. I think that this is also something that we can explore later. But now I would like to hear from Francesca.
Yes, thanks. As for the forces for, I would mention definitely the Catholic Church, especially after the publication of Laudato Si by Francis Pope and his initiative that is called The Economy of Francesco. Which I'm also part of, and it was an initiative to gather a lot of young change makers and academics and so on to create a new economic paradigm that is framed through the lens of just sustainability. And as I said before, also social movements and NGOs, environmental associations, I would say, that are part of the forces for, and in particular, Legambiente, which is the most famous environmental NGO in Italy, that has recently used the term climate justice, and also in the realm of climate-induced migration, and ASUD, which is also part of the EGEL project, and it was one of the first environmental association dealing with environmental justice and climate justice, and is now recently very engaged with the topic of climate change litigation, and is doing the first, I would say, the Italian Urgenda case in Italy, which is called Giudizio Universale, universal judgment, is against the Italian state because it's not respecting basically the international standards established by the Paris Agreement. And I would also mention among the forces for young scholars and students' curiosity. And this is just because I was often invited to give some lectures to explain what environmental justice is, what's the difference between environmental justice and climate justice. And that was only just because of them, because of their curiosity. And some courses of environmental justice were introduced into certain university courses because of them, because of their curiosity. And then as for the forces against, I would mention our current government, because of course a far-right government led by Giorgia Meloni doesn't help at all. But this would be a bit unfair because it wasn't that different, the situation even before. So I would say that the political landscape in Italy is not very sensitive concerning the environmental issues, and especially in their relationship with social justice. The only political party that was a little bit sensitive was the Five Star Movement, but it's not at the government anyway. Of course, among the forces against, I would mention lobbies and fossil fuel industries, and in particular Eni, which is a multinational energy company, because even though Eni has recently engaged with this funding of renewable energy, still it's in the direction of a green capitalism from my point of view. And then I would mention eco-mafia, so all those activities conducted by mafia against the environment. This is a term that was coined by Legambiente in 1994. And so if I had to identify some colonizers in Italy, I would say, yeah, mafiosi are definitely our colonizers. And I would love to see a decolonial turn in the future, because we actually need it. So I would stop here because my time is over. Thanks.
Thank you, Francesca, for this, I think, comprehensive overview of the different forces that act for or against achieving ecosocial justice within the context of Italy. I think that you raised hope by telling us that young scholars can be a force that acts in favor of justice. I hope that there are many people in the audience that are committed to justice and that are doing very important and interesting research that allows to advance our understanding, but also our impact. I would like to hear also from our last panel member on that prompt, Brendan.
Yes, thank you. This is great, by the way. I love the discussion. It's really interesting to see how we're coming at this from a lot of different perspectives. I'll start with the forces for, and I'll say that in France, it's been the diversification of the movement itself that is really giving me hope. The recent sort of evolution within the environmental movement has been one that coalesces sort of environmentalists, not only different strands of environmentalism, but also trade unionism and the global justice movement and public intellectuals and whatnot. And if we think at what happened in the US in the 90s, this is when the environmental justice movement really picked up. This is when it diversified and started coalescing a large section of civil society around the environmental justice perspective. And so I'm not sure this is going to happen in France, and certainly in France, and certainly not on this scale. But at least it gives me hope. The problem, of course, is that, and this is the biggest force against, is that the reaction to this has been one of very heavy repression and criminalization in France of the movement. One of the most visible evolutions or movements that we've seen was one that came out of the very long occupation of the zone to defend in Notre-Dame-des-Landes that was opposing an airport construction project that was cancelled in 2018, and it gave birth to a new movement that is called Le Soulèvement de la Terre, Earth Uprising, that coalesces all these different movements and is also inspired by the sort of direct action movements that you see in other parts of the world. And the reaction to that has been especially recently when they were fighting against the deployment of giant water storage infrastructure in different rural areas in France, has been very sort of heavy police repression and very heavy activist criminalization. And so that's definitely the biggest force against, is that the environment is becoming this reason for repression of the French state. This, of course, is in part tied to a similar situation that Francesca was describing, is that there's no real political force. There's no green. Well, there's a Green Party, but it's rather weak. There's a bit of an exception on European level where it's a bit stronger, but nationally it's quite weak. France has been described as a light green country because of the absence of the relative absence of its environmental movement for a long time, compared to Germany, for example. And so there's no real political force to sort of counterbalance that repression and criminalization of the state. And then I think a third element that I want to mention is what could be called a sort of justice washing, in a way, from different actors in the field. And well, this happens within the environmental field itself, within the environmental movement itself, that is using climate justice for all the wrong reasons, without never identifying what the injustices to be addressed are really, and therefore not really putting its action in line with solving these injustices. But that's one problem. But there's also increasingly the corporate sector that is using the language of environmental justice and climate justice, or the newest form is just transition, claiming that and sort of completely hollowing it out from the inside, and depoliticizing that term in quite a similar fashion as what we've seen with sustainable development discourses. But the French state itself is also doing that. The Yellow Vest has been this a very big citizen convention on the climate. That was a very interesting process. 150 citizens were chosen randomly to sit on that convention and to outline a whole set of proposals on climate change, but with a very heavy social justice focus to it. Most of that was just ignored by the government. So it's been going for months, and then once the bill came out, all these very interesting proposals had just disappeared. And this is another form of that justice washing, where, okay, we're going to set up that sort of citizens panel and use all the language of direct democracy and whatnot, but then in the end, we're not going to include it in any meaningful way in the environmental policy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Brendan. Very, very interesting indeed. To see how the French movement has been co-opted by governmental authorities in that way. So thank you all for your insightful comments on this second prompt, and I'd like you finally to share your take on the following set of questions. So do you think that the concept of planetary justice or some other similar concept has found its way into your region or your country, and if so, how, and what does planetary justice mean to you as a scholar? And sorry, we will start with you, Francesca, in this final round.
Yes, thanks. Well, I would say that in Italy we don't use the term planetary justice, or at least it's very rarely used. It's more like climate crisis or planetary boundaries. And again, at least the difference between environmental justice and climate justice, but only at the very academic level. In the public discourses, I would say that this topic is addressed through the lens of to the framework of climate crisis. And well, if I have to think about something similar, I would say that probably the proposal advanced by Luigi Ferraioli, A Constitution for the Earth, goes to this direction. But honestly, it didn't have a wide appeal, especially in the broader audience. but it was recently translated in Spanish, by the way, his book. And the thing is that how we can create a sort of global constitution to address all those questions that are not possible to be addressed by nation states and all the limits of nation states. Basically, this is the main idea, and I think that is the only thing that goes more or less to this towards this direction. And as for what planetary justice is to me, well, to me is a new theoretical framework that can actually overcome the dichotomy between the human and non-human world. I mean, if I think about the limits of environmental justice, I think that one of the limits is that it's difficult to address the injustice that raised from the two words, I would say, because of its anthropocentric perspective. So perhaps planetary justice can overcome this issue and can add, I would say, a further scale that is about the Earth system governance. Because if we use environmental justice, we can cover of course, the local level, the national level, the international level and global level, but perhaps not the Earth system governance or Earth system governance level, so to speak. So, but this is my opinion on that.
Thank you, Francesca. So yeah, indeed, a way to bridge or to bridge the gap between the human and human dichotomy. So next, I would like to hear from Florian.
Yeah, okay. So concept of planetary justice, how has it found its way into the region? I started off by talking about this imperial lifestyles. We cause problems all over the world by our actions, but we are somehow isolated from feeling it and from learning any consequences, because there are these communities of justice and these boxes in which we think of justice. And the question now is how can we bring the planet into this box, to this community of justice? And it's not very easy. I think cosmopolitanism is a very old justice term, and it's a very old ethical discussion. But cosmopolitanism is in the political sphere is very, very, very weak. Everyone thinks you're crazy when you're talking about cosmopolitanism. But what I find interesting is particular ways how the planet or the global scale or the population beyond the limits of the national boundary, the national border, can somehow come into our German box. And I want to highlight two examples here not from science, but from legislation, from law. There is a growing possibility, and there is a growing discussion about the all affected principle in law, so that not only people who are part of German people can go to court in Germany, but all people who are affected by a certain action from, for example, a German company. And there are first cases where this is somehow lived in German law, so that people from outside, parties from outside, can sue German companies in front of German courts. And the other one is supply chain legislation. So there is the talk about a legislation where companies can make responsible not just for their own actions, but for the working and environmental conditions of their suppliers. And we are living in an export-oriented economy, and we are linked all over the world to China and whatever. And this would mean that we are not longer so isolated from what goes on in other parts of the world. So this would be an entry point for, let's say, the planet into our into our justice system. So these are all ways of challenging this imperial lifestyle and establish something else there.
Okay, thank you very much, Florian. I hope we can get back to this in the discussion. So now I would like to ask Sherilyn, sorry, to share her views. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, the answer to has the concept of planetary justice found its way into the UK, I would have to say no. I first learned about the idea, the term, when I started working with Dimitri, Agni, and Stefan on a special issue on planetary justice for the journal Environmental Politics, which I'm editor of. So that's how I first learned about it. I haven't seen it used beyond, certainly in my circles of environmental politics research or in activism. So what I had to do is look for something similar. And the first thing I saw that I think is comes a little bit close is Kate Raworth's concept of donut economics, which was quite popular, has been quite popular in the UK. It was originally came out of an Oxfam research project and she developed this idea of presenting the notion of living in a donut, right? Living life in a donut, which kind of maps onto the notion of, Rockstrom's notion of the safe operating space for humanity. So that's a kind of way of bringing discussions of eco-social justice into the kind of notion of a finite planet. Beyond that, what I had to do is look for examples of the integration of environmental justice and social justice in the UK. As I said earlier, there's a lot of, it's very fragmented, I think, in the UK. So looking for articulations of trying to bring the two together is not that easy. There's several academics who are well known for making the case. So Ian Goff is one, Karen Bell is one, and they've increasingly tried to talk about things like an eco-social contract or eco-social policies, which really are about integrating the social and the ecological with justice at its core. And in terms of campaigning, those types of ideas of integrating, looking at a holistic understanding of eco-social justice would be in something like the Green New Deal Rising, where campaigners are trying to advance the notion of a kind of eco-social contract that has popular appeal across diverse communities in the UK. And that's the closest thing that I can find. What it means to me, I would say instead of what it means to me, it's like, how do I feel about it? And on the one hand, I think I very much like this concept of a planetary justice as a kind of alternative to climate justice. So I think I think climate justice is quite limiting in its kind of analysis. I think it militates against a kind of comprehensive and holistic understanding of the issues. So I'm quite in favor of Jason Moore's argument that we need to go beyond climate justice and start to look at intersecting and interconnected systems that drive the current crisis. And I think so he's offering a kind of integrated analysis that I would have to say ecofeminists have been making for at least 30 years, but Jason Moore is making it much more palatable, I suppose, in the way he writes. My other point, though, just to finish how I feel about it, is I am a little bit ambivalent because for the similar reasons that I'm a bit suspicious of maybe Earth systems and Anthropocene thinking, because I think the more we look at the holistic, the whole planet view, the greater we risk not looking at specific systems like capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. And I think looking at the whole planet and the whole Earth at once, we need to be really careful that we're not overlooking specific diversity differences, inequalities, and so forth that cause they're at the root of the problem that of injustice. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sherilyn. Indeed, we have to be wary of this concepts that that can be a bit universalistic, right? And that might at some point ignore the differentiations between different contexts, and then also between the different responsibilities that we bear in terms of answering to the ecological crisis. But I would like to, last but not least, ask Brendan to reflect on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, same here. There's no, I mean, the French have barely picked up environmental justice this far. So, you know, planetary justice is a step too far, you know? Yeah, no, no, definitely not. It's not been picked up. And even if it was, they would probably transform it into planetary inequality or something like that. No, I'd say if you think of planetary justice as a scalar thing, in terms of the politics of scale, then I think there's an overlap with how climate justice is being understood in certain activist circles in France, because climate justice originally was, at least in part, a sort of north-south issue. Right, climate justice was about not impacting, disproportionately burdening the global south with what was triggered by the global north. Right, then it evolved from that, but originally that's sort of where where it came from. Right, and so if the planet means that scalar issue, then there's that. Right. If on the other hand the planet sort of refers more to sort of ecological take or multi-species take or non-human justice, then what you see in the recent environmental movements that I mentioned earlier, you see a tendency, at least a willingness in trying to think about how to integrate this human non-human relationship into their action. The group that I mentioned, the Soulèvement de la Terre, one of their big slogans is "We are nature defending itself," right? Or "We are water," or you know, they're trying to make that link, not always in a very effective way, but at least they're thinking about it through what could be seen as a sort of more ecological or multi-species justice take, right? So that I would say are the two closest concepts we have as for me, I would align with what Sherilyn just said in terms of invisibilizing the risk of invisibilizing certain realities, especially in a context where France is only beginning to see how, you know, this concept overlap with sort of racial justice issues in its neighborhoods. But there's also another risk. It's more like slightly different, that it trivializes the concept of justice, right? That it's going to, there's been a lot of developments on justice in recent years. Earth system justice, planetary justice, what was it? I can't remember. Bio justice, ecological justice, multi-species justice, and whatnot, right? And yeah, I'm just going to throw it in there, but what do they add on top of environmental justice that wasn't in there from the beginning, right? I'm not saying they don't add anything. I'm just asking whether, is this not, how much of this is academic hair splitting on a concept, and how much is this is really adding something to and giving us the tools to address certain injustices that we've pre-identified. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I think, yeah, it's very important to have those webinars, those spaces to further discuss the conceptualization of planetary justice. So yeah, I would like to thank you so much. Thank you very much for sharing your reflections. I really enjoyed the perspectives that you shared and how they advance our thinking on planetary justice, on ecosocial justice. So I think we now, I'm looking at Agni, but I think we now have about 30 minutes, maybe a bit less,
Yes.
for the
So,
Q&A to extend
yes,
the
and
discussion.
so there are a few questions in the chat that Stefan can read for you, but feel free also to, you know, if you have a burning question, Caroline, coming out of this discussion, you're also free to, of course, ask this.
Okay, so let's take first
to Stefan. Yes.
Yeah, the questions from the audience.
Okay, first of all, I would encourage people to post some more questions in the chat, because at the moment I have a list of 3 that I'm going to read up here. So the first one was from Eda Bulbul, and she's asking Brendan specifically whether or not you could say add something to your take on justice washing. What is your perspective on just energy transition partnerships in the context of justice washing?
I know to me was just another form of a clean development mechanism that was invented in Glasgow, was it? But that's a very shallow take on something that I've little knowledge of. So I don't know. I guess we should be wary of these big schemes using words like justice and equality in funding large energy infrastructure. And compare this to what comes out of the energy justice energy justice movement or community energy, and see whether, if that overlaps. Part of the possibilities of renewable energy is its capacity to decentralize the production of energy. And I'm not sure that these big funding schemes and replacing carbon, which is a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but replacing carbon is only one part of our problem, especially when we're talking about environmental justice. Sometimes calling for reducing emissions across the board without taking into account the diversity of lived experiences on the ground may not be the best solution for environmental justice. So yeah, I don't know that specific case. I'll leave it here, but happy to discuss this further once I know what this mechanism does exactly.
Thank you, Brendan.
Okay, should I move on to the next one?
Okay.
Yeah, so the next one is very specific. It's for you, Francesca. And could you please share the link to the book you mentioned? I think the book you mentioned was on A Constitution of the Earth.
Constitution for the Earth,
Yeah.
by Luigi Ferraioli. I will put it in the chat. So
yeah, thanks for that. And then the next question is from Dimitris. Could all and any of the panelists comment on whether planetary justice or world or global justice or some other term would be useful for the scale implied by planetary limits or the Anthropocene/Capitalocene? So is planetary justice or some other term useful for the scale implied by planetary limits or the Anthropocene/Capitalocene? And also you can think in terms of world systems and so forth. I think maybe we could leave that question for until I've gotten through this small list, so we could save that.
Yeah.
But please think about that, so we can have a discussion about that afterwards. And then again, there's a specific question to Sherilyn, if she could possibly repeat the author and source who is now discussing theories that ecofeminists have been discussing for 30 years. So maybe you could just put that in the chat there, Sherilyn.
I'd be happy to put something in the chat, yeah.
Thanks. And the next one is from David Schlossberg, who many of you will know. Hi all, Great stuff, and huge thanks for the breadth of those responses. One point on the ecological side. Remember, ecological justice has been central to EJ in the US from the start, and the first principle of environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and interdependence of species. So that's not planetary justice, but it definitely is a link between environmental and ecological justice, and especially in the indigenous US space. So that is a good point raised by Schlossberg here.
And then there is a question, a specific question from David as well, a bit below.
Yeah. So the specific question from David is, some touched on this, but what is the relationship between environmental justice and arguments/practices that enhance democratic engagement? Is democratic practice strengthening democracy seen as a potential avenue to address these barriers?
Great question.
And I think maybe this is a good time to answer some of the questions, so we don't just end up reading questions for the rest of the webinar.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. So perhaps we can start with the first order that we had for the first prompt. Brendan, would you like to answer some of those questions? Maybe the question by David.
Difficult questions. On the scale issue, initially my understanding was that. So when I first heard the term, I thought planetary justice was about that scalar dimension. And so I guess the answer is yes, it could help in making that visible. But then, do we need a new term? Do we need a new form of justice to make that scalar dimension visible, or is that a sort of subset of or is that just environmental justice on a different scale, right? And if we do that, are we not sort of trivializing the sort of notion of justice, or displacing it in favor of another sort of conceptual discussion? I don't know. I don't have an answer, but this is something that I'm worried about. As for David's question, there's been two developments on this. One is the one that I mentioned, is the Citizens Convention in France, which explicitly made that link between it was a response to the yellow vests, right? There's too little democratic engagement in certain parts of the country, which leads to this feeling of marginalization, which explain in part the yellow vest, right? It wasn't about the environment, right? Let's not kid ourselves. It was about people not being heard in certain parts of the countries, and being frustrated by that for a lot of good reasons. And this just came on top of this, and so the response was probably a very good one in trying to organize a sort of citizen panel on climate change. Too bad it was just hollowed out later on, but this link was made very explicit. In Belgium, there's been another tradition of experimenting with citizens' parliament in the last few years, which initially didn't have anything to do with the environment. So basically, the idea is that part of the parliament becomes people randomly selected within the population in order to have a better representation of that. And there's been a lot of experimentation with this, and recently some public intellectuals have voiced the idea that this perhaps could be a tool to to justify taking environmental action, because environmental action is always perceived by politicians as a hard sell. And if you would sort of take it out of that sort of political context and put it in the hands of a more sort of direct form of democracy, then perhaps we could find a sort of common ground, a consensus for more stringent political action on the environment.
Thank you, Brendan. Florian, would you like to react as well to that question, or maybe take another one? I'm not sure that Florian is with us. Maybe we can just.
Can you hear me? Hello, can you?
Oh, yeah.
You can't see me, but you can hear me, is it?
Yes.
Because I'm
exactly.
constantly struggling with my camera. But you see myself, but I don't see myself in the. You don't see me. I'm waving here. You don't see me, but you can hear me anyway.
We can hear you, so that's the most important.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. The first question, maybe I can answer it in the same order that Brandon did. The first question is planetary justice a good concept to address this scale issue of planetary boundaries and these things? Maybe I can qualify it in two ways. I think it's in scientific terms, it might be an interesting avenue to think certain topics anew and to put into a new context by really accepting the planetary scale of our actions and their consequences. On the other hand, in political terms, I think it's not a very strong it's not a very strong concept. What I see, it's a little bit like your concept of justice. The weaker you get, the more you struggle to really make your point. And if you still expand it further, I don't know whether you really gain something from that. What we have here in Germany is this very strong concept of climate justice, which is very strong in Fridays for Future movement, which is rather dominant here in Germany. But I don't think that planetary justice would really add something substantial to that in political terms. The second question is the relationship between democracy and environmental justice, which I find very, very interesting. And I think the first reaction of many people would be to say, yeah, surely it's one thing. You can only be democratic if you want to be just and if you want to really think about environmental justice. But I'm not so sure about that. I think in certain situations, democracy, which always entails the acceptance of people who see things fundamentally different from you, and you have somehow to live with them. You have to somehow live with them, with these opinions. Very often are some kinds of, I wouldn't say barriers, but somehow challenges in really establishing new forms of just relationships. But at the same time, I would say that if we talk about justice, there are different forms of justice, and David should, well, he's not the first to hear it. And we have something like procedural justice. We have not just the relation, the justice of distributing things, but also of participating in decisions. And I would say in these terms, well, you cannot live without democratic decision making.
Okay, thank you, Florian. Sherilyn and Francesca, would you like to briefly react to those questions as well? maybe on the relationship between justice and democracy. Sherilyn, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly don't think there's much hope for planetary democracy. But I think definitely in terms of trying to promote a popular support for an ecosocial justice agenda, I think democracy is vital. And I think that the more we see examples of certain types of citizens' assemblies, the more we study them, the more we understand what effects they can have. I think the more we can be convinced that this is something we need to promote and institutionalize. I don't see much hope for that ever happening in the UK, even though we've had some prominent examples of some citizens' assemblies in the UK. But I think I'm very interested in addition to democracy, more coalition building and solidarity and movement building across diverse movements in the UK. And if that could happen, that might have a big effect on an optimistic future for ecosocial or even planetary justice.
Thank you, Sherilyn. Francesca, very briefly.
Yes, I think that translocal alliances could help in this construction of coalition building and something like that, and also the existence of international organizations and international social movements that can actually create a new landscape and a new energy in our in the boundaries and within our countries. I've noticed that in Italy was extremely beneficial the existence of Fridays for Future, for example, or Extinction Rebellion and other social movements like this, because help to familiarize young scholars with terms like environmental justice or climate justice in a country where those terms were almost unknown since the early 20s. So I think that this is extremely useful to enhance also democracy within our country, and also beyond our the boundaries of our nation states, to create translocal alliances and perhaps to overcome the north-south divide. And so yeah, and I also wanted to comment on the justice washing debate, because I agree, I totally agree with Brandon that there is a sort of abuse of the term justice, and which is now because I've noticed that now the term justice is used as a sort of adjective instead of the noun. So everything is climate justice or energy justice or water justice, whatever is justice, right? And so do we actually need a new term? I don't know. Perhaps we don't need a new term, because there are so many terms that it's rather confusing. But I want to add another provocation, I would say. So do we actually need also ecological justice? I mean, was it that necessary at that point, or it's enough to have environmental justice on the one hand and environmental ethics on the other hand, for example, and to leave certain things in the hands of religion, for example, like moral duties, our moral duties on nature, on animals, or the non-human world? I mean, are we sure that the term justice can be so overextended to cover everything, or perhaps other terms like other realms like religion, or perhaps health? I mean, if I think about health, the new debate on One Health, perhaps it could be better, right, to accommodate all those scales. But this is, yeah, a huge provocation, perhaps.
Yeah, let's let this this provocative question sink in. I would say with the audience. Thank you, Francesca. Stefan, are there other questions, specific questions from the audience that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, I have 4 questions on my list. I'll see how far we get. But the first one is from Franken, LL. So what do you think would be the advantage or disadvantage of using the concept of planetary justice rather than a concept such as planetary ethics? Is his question, or hers. And I would say that this speaks to what you just were talking about, Francesca. And if I can shoot in something from my own ideas, I would say that a planetary ethics is a sort of is something that has to come before you can really get planetary justice. So, but that is my personal viewpoint. If anyone else has something to shoot in on this, please, go ahead and do that.
Can I just intersect because I think we have only very few minutes left. So maybe Stefan can read the essence of the questions, and then just feel free to pick one question that you want to answer, including with the final, thing that you would like to say. And then I will hand it over to Caroline for the final reflection.
Yeah. Excellent idea. And then there is Florence van Durm, who is also pointing out that planetary justice is a concept that might, as Sherilyn just was talking about, might sort of hide the particularities of specific local context and so forth. And then there's Daphne Gunenk, who is saying that, is it possible to say that there is these distinctions between the global north and the global south? So especially in legal cases, is it more likely that decisions can be made in the global north that would be effective than in the global south? I think it's one way of summarizing that one. And then Manisha Anantaraman has an interesting question, which I have condensed to: is there a revolutionary agent of planetary justice in Europe? And I think this was directed specifically to Florian. And then at the final question is from Anna Noel Pattison. And she says, thank you to the wonderful panelists. How does planetary justice take into account the normative aspect of justice compared to environmental justice? And that's all from me. So take your pick, and I'll leave you, Caroline, up to take charge again.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stefan, for summarizing the questions of the audience. We all know that's quite a difficult task. Yeah, who would like to start? Maybe Florian, on the question that you heard just now, that was directed to you, and perhaps you can also have some final words.
Yeah, okay. Maybe just answering to, I'm not sure whether you hear me right, because I have the feeling that my relations.
We hear you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe this question of well, who can bring about change and injustices in North-South injustices. The authors of the study of imperial lifestyles would prefer revolution. They compare all kinds of goodwill intentions in the North to something like education of princes. So the question is not to educate the princes better so they can be better rulers, but the thing is to end monarchy. To really change the global structure. I'm not really sure if you want to know my personal view. I think that I wouldn't opt for the necessity of revolutionary shifts, but maybe deep reform shifts. And it really goes to re-evaluating our values and rethinking our ways of living. And I'm really intrigued by what Francesca just said about her provocation. If we constantly scale up this notion of justice and even bigger to planetary scale, maybe we can think about where are the limits of this this concept, and maybe we can think about other concepts. Well, she brought in religion or other ways of thinking about the planetary scale. I would love to think about in terms of justice and rights. I would love to think about duties of people and whatever. But this would be a whole other discussion.
Great, thank you, Florian. Let's go with Francesca next. So very briefly, maybe one question or just your final words.
Yeah, perhaps I can pick the final question. How can we use the concept of planetary justice in a normative framework, right? So I think that in this regard, perhaps planetary justice can have something to say, because it can perhaps address certain new unknown problems that we can encounter in our in a normative in a global normative framework. For example, I think about climate-induced migration or disappearing lands. I mean, all those issues that are unknown from a legal perspective can be perhaps addressed by planetary justice, or at least I would think about a new concept to address new things that are not regulated at all from any global treaties. So that's my final reflection on this.
Thank you, Francesca. Sherilyn, would you like to have a final word and pick up a question, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we're sort of thinking about a debate about how useful is this concept of planetary justice, and I don't want to come to a webinar about planetary justice and say I don't know if it is, but I for my work and my interests, I suppose I still see the need for more local and maybe translocal understandings of justice. I think democracy and debate and deliberation works better at a local scale. I think that and I guess I think that, you know, what is gained from thinking about it. I think obviously I don't think we haven't ever not thought about environmental politics in a global scale. But I think that the risks, as I said earlier, of not thinking about things like decolonizing the entire debate or thinking about reparation and that kind of notion of global justice, that I still think we haven't really got to grips with. I think that still is, for me, more salient than a notion of planetary justice. I'll have to think more about it and be persuaded. I have an open mind, but I think for me, there's other more pressing concepts to be working with.
Thank you, Sherilyn. And finally, Brendan.
Yes, thanks. This resonates with a lot of discussions we've had in the last years, not specifically on planetary justice, but on the limits of the concept of environmental justice, and especially with what I've seen with younger scholars, PhD students that don't entirely feel comfortable with expanding the concept beyond and taking it to a new place than where it originally originated, right? And so it's a real question: when do we stop talking about justice? When does it become something else, right? And yeah, I don't have a final answer, but it's something that is there, and that we at some point need to address. I'll pick up on one question that was in the group on the difference between global north and the global south.
Very briefly, yeah, thank you.
Yes, we did a seminar recently in Bordeaux in France with the French Environmental Justice Network on environmental justice from the global south, to go beyond this sort of rather dominant perspective on well, environmental justice in the south is about environmental conflicts, right? There's this sort of overlap between these two things, whereas we were wondering whether there was also a sort of theoretical contribution to that discussion. One of the things that came out very briefly was that there's a lot more relations of dominations and power relations within the global south than what we are confronted with in the global north, and therefore that sort of course changes the idea of environmental justice and of the injustices that need to be addressed. There's a very good book actually, but it's in French, I'm afraid, that came out last year that is titled Environmental Justice in Africa, and that addresses some of these things. So if you read French, that's a very good source. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan, for the reference. Yeah, thank you very much to our panelists. Agni, do I have 1 minute, 2 minutes to share a few reflections? Okay, great. Yeah, so I would like to share just 3 reflections. Yeah, I learned a lot from your perspective and the different contexts that you study. But I think that one commonality that we can find between these different contexts is the political landscape, right? There's in many countries in Western Europe more repressive political contexts, and also an unfavorable socio-political context, as you have mentioned, Sherilyn, in the UK. With populist movements gaining ground, and that are a very strong counterforce to achieving planetary justice. And this is also reflected in the public opinion or within these countries. Second, I think what's important also to reflect on is how the concept emerged, right, in Western Europe, and it's actually very recent compared to the US. And there are different fashions in which the concept emerged. So it has emerged as a top-down fashion in the case of the UK, for instance, and we have seen that it's a bit more bottom-up in the cases of Germany, Italy, and France. And also there are very different theoretical roots to that concept in Western Europe, ranging from sociology to political ecology, economics, also with a similar concept of environmental inequalities. But what I think is interesting is that in recent years, there's been this turn towards decolonial theory, and it becomes a bit more rooted into decolonial theory. And finally, I think it's important also to reflect on the goals of those movements and their repertoire of action. Yeah, we see that there's different goals: disrupting capitalism, patriarchy, imperialism, as you mentioned, Florian. I think that there are different modes of action, and one is that is more and more used, and that you all mentioned here, is the role of law, and how law is how do you say, is taken as a mode of action to try to achieve planetary justice. Yeah, and final thing, I think what you said, and that also resonates, is that we see that the movement diversifies and globalizes, I think it's important that in order to advance planetary justice, there's the building of coalition between actors, between sectors, but also within our own academic context, right? We have to think outside of our own disciplinary boxes. You mentioned a lot boxes, Florian. So I think, yeah, we need to think outside of our boxes and foster transdisciplinary collaborations on that topic. And I will stop here. Thank you so much for staying for another 4 minutes.
And from my side too, and from our side, from Dimitris and Stefan and their System Governance Project, thank you very much to everyone for incredibly rich discussions and wide-ranging ideas, and also to Caroline for excellent moderation and reflections. If you want to know, and of course you, our audience, and if you want to know more about planetary justice, as Sherilyn mentioned, there's going to be a special issue, hopefully soon, appearing in Environmental Politics. And you are welcome to join the Task Force on Planetary Justice, where we have these discussions. You don't have to actually believe in planetary justice, but we are having actually these debates whether it's useful or not. And finally, this was our second webinar, and we're going to have more to come. So the third one is probably going to be Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. And so also stay tuned on that. We are you're gonna hear from the usual channels. And of course, yes, Jane, Camille, and all the people that work to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.